Top of the morning, Dan and Amy, and yesterday's COVID task force briefing, President Trump and his team. Dr. Deborah Birx was there as the infectious disease expert, and she said a couple of important things that should not go unremarked upon, even as I think most in the D.C. press corps will miss it. One, in terms of the response and the preparedness, the pandemic preparedness. Why the experts, forget the politicians, the experts were flat-footed. Because had the experts had the foresight to imagine what a COVID-19 outbreak could look like or something akin to it, then obviously we would have had more personal protection equipment, or they would have been banging the drums for it and having it distributed and other measures taken with respect to testing and how we do testing in this country for something like this. You know, the experts in the field didn't predict this, so it's a bit of a fool's errand. It's a bit disingenuous to be berating politicians that you don't like for similarly not having the foresight. Birx explained what they didn't foresee.
Now, as all of our testing is improved, and we want to really applaud the group who has worked on it. You know, if you look at the pandemic flu preparedness, all of this was built on a flu platform. It was never, ever thought that you'd have a simultaneous respiratory disease hitting at exactly the same time as your flu hits in the country. And so when you're doing all of your flu surveillance, you could have small cases of these pneumonias and flu-like illnesses characterized as a flu-like illness for the last 4 to 6 weeks. And so that's really a caution to all of us. And so when we get through all of this, we'll be looking at each of the pandemic preparedness plans.
One other thing, the models, the misreporting on these models, and the reporting on the models that persists even as evasive actions are taken that change the course of the outbreak. And data is coming in that should inform these models. But the models like Imperial College London of 2 million Americans dead and 500,000 Brits and 60 million people infected in this country, 70 million people, half the population, all these worst case scenario models. Yeah. Listen to Deborah Birx, Dr. Deborah Birx.
I wanted to say one other thing, because you see a lot of numbers out there about 70% of the population is going to get infected or 60% of the population based on those models. Understand that the way you get to that number is you do nothing, and it goes through 3 cycles. So they're talking about this cycle that we're currently in, another cycle in 2021, and a third cycle in 21-22 in order to get that level of population infected. And you know we will have vaccines most likely by the 21-22 season. And we're going to hopefully have therapeutics in the fall of the next season. So the reason we're so much focused on blunting the curve for this piece is if the virus comes back, we'll have much more facility both for diagnosis, testing, monoclonal antibodies, treatments, and then the vaccine.
That is just a critical statement. Based on 3 years of doing nothing, those models. What have we done in the last 30 days? So for those in your circles of influence that are in full panic still, please share Dr. Deborah Birx's words with them about those models they're relying on to run around like chickens without necks. For more on this, the economic piece of it in particular, we're pleased to be joined by Daniel Klein, professor of economics and the JIN chair at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Professor Klein, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good to be here.
So we were talking about the proposals with respect to the aid to businesses and families alike. And just sort of a predicate question before we even get into the particular proposals. President Trump, per his briefing yesterday, seems quite antsy to get things churning again. Is that your perspective, that we need to start moving with a certain amount of alacrity to get people back to work and this economy running again, or you're going to do the sort of structural damage that will be a long time in repairing?
I'm afraid I don't know. I don't have a clear answer. I don't pretend to know. It's super complicated, and we don't know the projection of this. I'm being very cautious. I'm actually in Sweden at present, but regardless, I would be very cautious still, and that's still my attitude. So I'm afraid I don't have a good position for you
Well, what is life
on that
like in
matter.
Sweden, and how many cases do they have, and are the stores, bars, and restaurants shut down?
Much less so than elsewhere, especially in Europe. Much less so. It's been an outlier, Sweden, in terms of its attitude and its policy. My 18-year-old daughter, believe it or not, is still going to cheerleading practice where they're stunting with each other. I have grave misgivings about this, but she's a strong-willed 18-year-old, so she wins.
Yeah.
We've had 33 deaths here in Sweden, which doesn't sound like a lot. It's a 10 million population. But in the last 2 days, 12 of those 33 have died.
So about
From coronavirus.
Yes.
Okay.
about 2,000 cases overall in Sweden, and because of that spike in deaths, the politicians there were forced to be a little bit less laissez-faire. They moved to shut universities, senior high schools, ban gatherings of more than 500, as well as encouraging citizens to avoid all non-essential travel, stuff that every other country has done, and then some. But that seems to be, even though businesses is still open. They've taken a very much more hands-off approach even still.
That's true.
So can you still go in a restaurant and sit down and have dinner?
Yes, absolutely, if you so choose, but they're quite empty.
Talking more generally about this, then, a piece that you wrote talks about the relaxing of red tape. President Trump has said much about that when it comes to these potential antiviral treatments and trying to get them to clinical trials and get them to market if they prove effective. And you make the point that perhaps that's one of the new normals that we should have after this pandemic subsides, is a consideration of removing those regulatory bottlenecks generally that we only seek to remove in crisis.
Yes, I think that the situation now, the emergency, helps us to see some of the problems of what we've been doing all along. I'm basically a free market economist. I'm from George Mason University Economics, and we're sort of renowned for being free marketeers. And I do think that this experience helps us see that these bottlenecks, as you put it, are not only bad for bad times, they're also bad for good times. And so I think we should indeed try to shed a lot of the restrictions that we have, not only in drug development and drug approval, but in personnel and work issues, occupational licensing, and many other things, facilities, certificate of need requirements for medical facilities and hospitals. They're relaxing restrictions now on different kinds of trucking restrictions. So a lot of this urgency only shows that we had bad rules, the badness of some of the rules we had all along.
What about in banking? Your colleague at Mercatus Center, Kevin Erdman, suggests that banks should get more discretion to make home equity loans and refinance mortgages, essentially provide individual liquidity for those seeking it.
I'm more agnostic. I don't disagree. I'm not. Banking and finance is always trickier. It's a rather different than, say, medical quality, because for a number of reasons, partly because the taxpayers are on the hook, partly because the financial system interrelates. Like one financial transaction relates to others, and you get systemic issues that you don't get in buying a drug or going to see a doctor. So I'm not sure. I'm going to pass on that as well. Sorry.
No, that's all right. You don't. It's fine.
I don't want to pretend to say no more.
It's better to be honest.
It's nice when somebody in academia or politics doesn't pretend to be omniscient. So that is fine. I wanted to get your reaction to a proposal that was offered by Edward Glazer, who's a economics professor at Harvard. For now, he says, pay workers to stay home. Cash payments, the most direct way to reduce the economic harm that lockdowns will inflict on as much as a fifth of workers employed in the service sector. But he does caution that the policymakers must resist the urge to extend these payments beyond the crisis to disincentivize work. Is that make the most sense to you? Is essentially, I mean, what he's saying is sort of what House or Senate Republicans have proposed, which is intercede to provide the resources that businesses use to keep their employees on payroll.
I do think that sometimes what's good in bad times is not good in good times. So in other words, there are certain emergency measures which I could certainly approve of, and these might be some. That is to say, requiring businesses to do certain things like pay people, or requiring businesses not to operate, or quarantining people, and so on. But these should definitely be considered temporary emergency measures. They're very bad for normal times.
Well, thinking about things that could be very bad for normal times, but difficult to unwind if you do them during an emergency time. One of the ideas that has been bandied about beyond the Fed's market interventions with treasuries and mortgage-backed securities is the government getting into the equity market the way that Japan did. And whether or not you think it's a good idea for the government to temporarily, at least theoretically, get involved in buying equities to prop up the stock market.
Yeah, I'm very anti that. That kind of thing worries me a great deal. And you make a great point that we should not be too ready to do these emergency measures simply because rolling them back, scaling them back after the emergency is not assured by any means. There tends to be a ratchet effect, as Bob Higgs has put it, where emergency measures get scaled back somewhat, but not necessarily all the way, and we get stuck with bad policy even in good times. And that kind of thing does definitely scare me. Like I said, I'm like a free market economist, small government guy. I think that's the true spirit of America's founding, and the original liberal movement that the 18th century, represented. So, yes, I'm with you on that. I'd be very, very careful about those kinds of emergency measures, especially.
And I presume that your position would be similar on nationalization, which thankfully on Sunday night President Trump resisted.
Yes. Again, I think those things would be especially hard to unwind. People get interest groups crop up that want to preserve those kinds of arrangements. You can see how difficult it is for Washington to cooperate to do anything, even things that, well, a lot of economists would consider clearly the right thing to do. So don't do stuff that's going to be hard to reverse.
He is Daniel Klein, professor of economics and JIN chair at the Mercatus Center, George Mason University. And thanks so much for joining us. Say hello to Bjorn Borg for us. We appreciate it.
Okay, if I see him. Thanks a lot.
Take care.
Tack så mycket. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy using the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
After 25 years of building websites for all kinds of companies in many different industries, AmericanEagle.com realized a well-designed website is also your best employee, bringing efficiency, revenue, production, showing up every day, giving above and beyond to increase your bottom line. That's what a website designed, developed, and hosted by AmericanEagle.com has brought to so many.